In the suffocating tropical darkness before dawn on the 4th of August, 1811, the Java coastline lay still beneath a ceiling of monsoon-born cloud. The surf rolled in heavy rhythmic pulses, breaking against a shallow beach scattered with driftwood and mangrove roots. Beyond the trees, unseen in the night, stretched the wide, low-lying plains of Batavia, swampy, fever-ridden ground that European soldiers dreaded. Yet out on the water, where the creaking of wooden hulls mingled with the hiss of the tide, an invading army waited. More than 24 British warships and scores of transports, some accounts placing the combined fleet near 60 vessels, lay just offshore, their lanterns hooded, their decks crowded with redcoats, sepoys, Highlanders, artillerymen, marines and boat crews standing by their oars. Nearly 12,000 men, half from British regiments and half from Bengal and Madras, were poised to carve open one of Napoleon's last global outposts. In the dim early hours, the humid air clung to wool uniforms like a second skin. Sweat already trickled beneath crossbelts, though the sun had not yet risen. On the flagship and across the fleet, the orders were quiet but urgent as boats began lowering into the dark water. On this night, the soldiers felt the weight of distance. They were thousands of miles from Europe, fighting not on the dusty plains of Spain nor the frozen rivers of Poland, but on a tropical island at the edge of Asia, one which Napoleon's administrators had labored to fortify into a fortress of empire. Java, formally annexed into the French imperial system after the Kingdom of Holland fell into Napoleon's hands in 1810, was more than a colony. It was a linchpin for trade, a staging ground for influence across Southeast Asia, and the crown jewel of vast Dutch holdings in the East Indies. The French-appointed Governor-General Jan Willem Janssens, twice battle-tested against the British and twice unfortunate in his encounters with them, now commanded its defence. His stronghold, Fort Cornelis, stood as a massive star fort, bristling with nearly 300 cannon, surrounded by plantations, forests, and complex redoubts. And yet, it was not here that the British would first strike, but on the quiet sands of Silinsing, a few miles to the east of Batavia, where the defenders did not expect a landing. The sea beyond the surf shimmered faintly with the first hints of dawn. Silhouettes of ships of the line, Illustrious, Minden, Scipion, loomed against a paling sky. Their decks were silent but bristling with strength. Broadsides that had crushed fleets from the Cape to the Moluccas, crews hardened by months of blockade, and marines prepared for the brutal work of amphibious assault. Around them clustered frigates, Caroline, Phaeton, Hussar, Sir Francis Drake, Nessus, Phoebe, leaner and quicker vessels that had spent the previous months hunting down French and Dutch gunboats in the labyrinthine coastline of Java. Naval skirmishes off Surabaya, bombardments near Merak, and daring captures of French rivercraft, including the destruction and seizure of gunboats by Captain Mounsell of HMS Procris, had cleared the way for this moment. Yet even with naval superiority, the greatest enemy of the expedition was not Janssens, nor his mixed army of Dutch, French, East Indies regulars and Javanese auxiliaries. It was the climate itself. Batavia was infamous across the globe for its pestilential air. Malaria, dysentery, and fevers had devastated garrisons for centuries. The defenders hoped the British would linger near the city long enough for disease to cripple them. The air smelled faintly of stagnant water and rotting vegetation drifting from the swampy interior. Soldiers sensed it as they inhaled, an invisible warning of what awaited inland. Still, the British had prepared for this. Lord Minto, Governor-General of Bengal, had personally joined the expedition. His presence symbolized the political significance of the campaign, one shaped by Sir Stamford Raffles, whose intelligence from Malacca had convinced the British that Java could be taken swiftly. Command of the troops rested with Lieutenant General Sir Samuel Auchmuty, who oversaw a combined European and Indian force composed of regiments such as the 14th, 59th, 69th, 78th Highlanders, 89th, 102nd, and the 22nd Light Dragoons. Alongside them marched the Bengal and Madras native infantry. Sepoys drilled in the same line formations and volley fire that defined British battlefield dominance. As the first longboats pushed off toward shore, The oars dipped quietly into the water. The British did not know what awaited them in the trees beyond the beach. Some expected musket flashes, others feared ambush by Javanese irregulars, but the darkness remained still. Slowly, the boats glided across the shallow breakers. Officers scanned the mangrove line, trying to discern movement. The Redcoats adjusted their packs and muskets, ready to step ankle-deep into the surf and march toward an enemy who had chosen to avoid confrontation at the water's edge. In less than an hour, the first waves touched the sand. The invasion of Java had begun. Behind the soldiers, the horizon brightened to a molten streak as the sun rose over a sea filled with British ships. Before them, through the palms and tangled undergrowth, lay the route to Batavia, then the great fortress of Cornelis, and beyond that, the interior plains where Janssens hoped to rally his surviving forces. The island would fall in just 44 days, but on this morning, the men stepping ashore could not know how swiftly their campaign would carve open Napoleon's last bastion in Southeast Asia. For now, there was only the smell of salt, the weight of their muskets, and the knowledge that a tropical empire stood ahead, one they had come to conquer. To understand the speed and precision of the British conquest, the story must step back from the surf of Silinsing and into the wider world that shaped this campaign. The invasion of Java in 1811 did not occur in isolation. It was the final act in a larger struggle that had unfolded across 3 continents. A struggle driven by Napoleon's attempt to extend his empire into the global trading networks of Asia, and Britain's determination to choke off every colonial possession the French could still claim. By the late 18th century, Java was the beating administrative heart of the Dutch East Indies, a colony that had brought extraordinary wealth to the Netherlands for almost 200 years. Spices, coffee, sugar, textiles, and a network of trading ports made the island one of the most valuable colonial assets in the world. The city of Batavia, though infamous for its deadly climate, served as a nexus for commercial power stretching from the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. But the Napoleonic Wars transformed these long-standing arrangements. When Napoleon absorbed the Kingdom of Holland directly into the French Empire in 1810, the East Indies fell under French control by extension. Java became, in effect, Napoleon's eastern fortress. The French-appointed Governor-General, Jan Willem Janssens, had already faced British arms before. In 1806, he was defeated at Blauberg in the Cape Colony by a British force that wrested control of southern Africa from the Dutch sphere. His second appointment, this time as governor of an even larger and more vulnerable colony, was both a promotion and a burden. He inherited the vast defensive network created by his predecessor, Herman Willem Daendels, who had spent years transforming Java into a militarized stronghold. Daendels strengthened coastal batteries, reorganized the colonial army, and built roads, hospitals, and barracks designed to withstand a major European invasion. His greatest achievement, the enormous star fort of Cornelis, stood south of Batavia as a fortress city of trenches, bastions, artillery positions, and outer redoubts. It was here that Janssens intended to make his stand. But the strategic environment was collapsing around him. In the years before the invasion, the British had swept across the Indian Ocean, dismantling French and Franco-Dutch colonies one by one. They captured Ambon and the Moluccas, seized Réunion and Mauritius, and crushed French privateering bases that threatened the lucrative India-China trade routes. By 1811, Java stood almost alone, isolated, blockaded, and expected to defend itself against a British expedition that everyone knew would eventually come. In Calcutta and Madras, British planners were already shaping that expedition. At the centre of the political machinery stood Lord Minto, the Governor-General of Bengal, who viewed the capture of Java as both a strategic necessity and a demonstration of British ascendancy in Asia. His close advisor, Sir Stamford Raffles, provided essential intelligence, the condition of Java's ports, the morale of its troops, and the intricate politics of its Javanese rulers. Raffles believed the island could fall quickly if struck with overwhelming force, and Minto agreed. The composition of the invading force reflected British power in the east. Nearly 12,000 men were assembled, Europeans from regiments such as the 14th, 59th, 69th, 78th Highlanders, 89th, 102nd, and the 22nd Light Dragoons, alongside battalions of Bengal and Madras native infantry. These sepoys, trained in British linear tactics, formed the backbone of the East India Company's armies. They were accustomed to tropical climates, accustomed to long marches, and accustomed to fighting with discipline in environments far different from Europe's battlefields. The assembling fleet, too, was formidable. Ships of the line like Illustrious, Minden, and Scipion carried firepower unmatched in the region. Frigates such as Caroline, Phaeton, and Hussar had already spent months probing the Javanese coasts, engaging French and Dutch vessels in sharp actions that weakened local naval resistance. The capture of French gunboats by HMS Procris near the Indramayu River, where 5 out of 6 enemy craft were seized or destroyed, gave the British the clear advantage in shallow coastal waters, often treacherous to large warships. The seas around Java were being systematically stripped of defenders even before the main invasion force arrived. When the expedition convened at Malacca in June 1811, it resembled a small floating city of soldiers, sailors, artillery, engineers, and administrators. The men baked under the tropical sun as they waited for final preparations. The decks swarmed with activity, muskets cleaned, artillery secured, rations loaded, and orders distributed. Supply ships carried everything from siege guns to medical stores. The army embarked with full expectations of battle, but also with the grim understanding that disease might kill more men than French musketry. By July, the fleet turned south toward Java. The winds filled the sails. The ships cut a steady path across the water. Heat shimmered above the decks, and the air had the thick, metallic taste of the coming monsoon season. Soldiers and sailors alike prepared for a campaign that would lead them through swamps, plantations, villages, pepper forests, and fortified strongholds. And all the while, Janssens dug in, abandoning exposed positions along the coast and pulling his forces inward toward Batavia and Fort Cornelis, determined not to scatter his strength, but to concentrate it for a decisive encounter. The stage was set. One of the last Franco-Dutch bastions of Napoleon's empire stood ready behind its walls and artillery. And now, the largest amphibious operation in the history of the East Indies was bearing down upon it. When the sun rose fully over the Java coastline, on the morning of August 4, 1811, the British Expeditionary Force was already ashore in strength. The landing at Silinsing, carefully chosen for its relative quiet and its position east of Batavia, had been executed with precision. Boat after boat had pushed through the surf, the soldiers stepping into the warm shallows with muskets raised, forming into ranks along the sandy beach. Palm trees rustled overhead in a humid breeze, and the first light revealed scattered clusters of huts, ponds, and tangled groves beyond the shoreline. Yet there was no concentrated resistance. The defenders had withdrawn, leaving only small detachments to watch the coast. The British had gained their foothold. For Lieutenant General Sir Samuel Auchmuty and Major General Robert Rollo Gillespie, the next step was clear. Secure a line of advance inland toward Batavia, probe for enemy formations, and determine whether Janssens intended to fight near the capital or withdraw into his fortified stronghold at Cornelis. The army began to push forward, moving through coconut groves, patches of open field, and narrow pathways between cultivated paddies. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the mixed scents of salt, earth, and the sap of broken vegetation trodden underfoot. As the morning advanced, the men of the Bengal and Madras native infantry, accustomed to tropical climates, marched with steady resolve, though the heat was oppressive even for them. European soldiers found the conditions more taxing. Sweat soaked into their red coats, and the glare of the sun off the wet fields stung their eyes. But the column pressed on. Guns and ammunition wagons followed close behind, dragged by teams of oxen straining in the rising heat. Engineers marked routes through the difficult terrain, clearing obstacles where needed. By midday, the British vanguard encountered the first real resistance. Sporadic musket fire echoed from skirmish lines hidden among trees and plantation edges, Dutch, French, and native East Indies soldiers probing the British advance. Gillespie's forward elements responded with disciplined volleys, pushing the defenders back along the narrow roads toward Veltevreden. As the Redcoats advanced, they discovered signs that Batavia was being abandoned. Roads were strangely empty, storehouses left half open, and scattered groups of enemy soldiers retreating in loose order toward the south. The defenders were not attempting to hold the capital. Janssens, aware of the futility of defending Batavia's swampy approaches against a stronger invading army, was falling back deliberately toward the fortified lines of Cornelis, where he aimed to concentrate his force of 8,000 to 10,000 men. He hoped the British would be slowed by the terrain, harassed by minor engagements, and consumed by disease before they reached the fortress. On August 8th, British troops entered Batavia. The once thriving colonial city, long plagued by sickness and decay, lay eerily silent. Many of its inhabitants had fled, others stayed hidden behind shuttered windows. Sections of the town showed signs of hasty retreat. Buildings near the docks bore scorch marks from fires set by defenders intent on denying supplies to the invaders. Canals, stagnant and foul-smelling, glistened in the sun, carrying the oppressive scent of rot. Soldiers marched cautiously through narrow streets, muskets at the ready, but found no large garrison awaiting them. As the Union flag was raised above the town, British officers surveyed the scene with a mix of relief and concern. The ease of taking Batavia suggested that Janssens intended a decisive stand elsewhere, and the abandoned city offered no respite from the island's deadliest foe, fever. The British command knew they could not remain long. Already, some men complained of dizziness and chills. Malaria thrived in the canals and marshlands. The army had to move south, toward higher, healthier ground, and toward the fortress that now held the core of enemy resistance. Reports soon reached Alkmaar that Janssens had concentrated his forces inside Fort Cornelis, a vast, star-shaped defensive complex south of the city. To reach it, the British would need to advance through plantations, open fields, and fortified positions around Weltevreden, a military suburb where Janssens had prepared outlying defences. The approach would not be unopposed. On August 10th, as British units advanced toward Weltevreden, they encountered a Franco-Dutch force holding a line across the road. The defenders fought fiercely, using their familiarity with the terrain to their advantage. Musket volleys cracked from behind earthworks and from the edges of wooded patches. A French general, Alberti, mistook British light infantry for his own Javanese auxiliaries and was killed in the confusion. The engagement ended with the defenders retreating in disorder, leaving more than 300 dead or wounded on the field, while British casualties remained under 100. The fall of Weltevreden gave Alkmaar a forward base within striking distance of Fort Cornelis, but the terrain that separated the army from the fortress was thick with forest, pepper plantations, and concealed trenches. Gillespie, commanding the vanguard, reported that the approach would require cutting pathways through dense vegetation before artillery could be brought forward. Engineers began hacking through undergrowth, marking routes wide enough for siege guns, while reconnaissance parties mapped enemy positions hidden among the trees. The British now stood on the threshold of the campaign's decisive phase. Ahead lay the strongest defensive position in the East Indies, bristling with artillery, redoubts, palisades, and thousands of troops. The march from the coast had been swift. The capture of Batavia had been almost effortless, but the storming of Fort Cornelis would demand the full weight of British siegecraft and the raw, determined courage of the men who would fight their way through its outer works under blistering heat and deadly fire. As the British army established itself at Weltevreden, the true scale of the challenge ahead came into view. South of the newly captured position, hidden behind dense vegetation and sprawling plantations, lay the immense fortification that would decide the fate of Java. Fort Cornelis. Built under the energetic and authoritarian rule of Herman Willem Daendels, the fortress sprawled across a vast area, protected by a network of bastions, trenches, artillery platforms, and outlying redoubts. Nearly 300 cannon ringed its defences. The ditch surrounding the main works was broad and deep, and the outer perimeter bristled with obstacles. Within, Janssens concentrated his 8,000 to 10,000 soldiers, Dutch regulars, French officers, native East Indies troops, artillerymen from Celebes, and a mix of auxiliaries from across the archipelago. The fort's design followed principles inspired by European star fort architecture, yet adapted to the tropical landscape. Earthworks replaced some stone structures, providing resilience against humidity and monsoon rains. Palisades reinforced weak points, and gun positions commanded open killing grounds stretching toward the forest edge. Janssens believed this fortified stronghold could slow, bleed, or even break the invading army. And for the British, the challenge was not merely to defeat the defenders in open battle, it was to uproot them from a fortress built specifically to repel a European assault. On August 14th, British engineers began the laborious task of preparing siege operations. The terrain between Veltevreden and Fort Cornelis was a dense sprawl of jungle patches, tangled pepper plantations, and narrow tracks barely wide enough for pack animals, let alone artillery. The air was damp and heavy, the ground muddy from intermittent rains. The constant hum of insects mixed with the crackle of skirmisher fire as enemy outposts engaged British forward elements. Every yard of progress had to be earned with axe, spade, and musket. British columns advanced cautiously, clearing trees and brush, while staying alert for concealed defensive works. Sepoys of the Bengal native infantry often led these efforts, accustomed to tropical environments and nimble in close ground scouting. Behind them followed detachments of the 14th, 59th, 69th, and other British regiments, forming protective screens as engineers hacked pathways through the undergrowth. Oxen strained to drag siege guns forward, their hooves sinking into soft earth. The heat pressed down like a physical force, slowing every movement and draining soldiers' strength more effectively than musket fire. By mid-August, the first British batteries were in place approximately 600 yards north of the fort. These positions, carved out of the plantations, were manned by Royal Marines and sailors from the fleet, alongside East India Company artillery. Their heavy guns opened fire, initiating a prolonged exchange with the defenders. The thunder of cannon echoed through the trees each day, followed by plumes of smoke drifting lazily above the canopy. The defenders responded in kind. Cornelis erupted with counter-battery fire from multiple bastions, trying to silence the British guns before they could edge closer. The siege soon turned violent. On August 22nd, in the pre-dawn darkness, the defenders launched a bold sortie against the British lines. Moving silently through shadowed plantation paths, Franco-Dutch forces struck with sudden ferocity. They overran 3 British batteries, spiking guns and threatening to roll up the siege positions before sunrise. But the assault faltered as Bengal sepoys and soldiers of the 69th Foot rallied, counter-attacking with disciplined volleys despite the low visibility. In the gritty back-and-forth fighting that followed, the attackers were driven back toward the fort, leaving dead and wounded scattered across the field. The British reoccupied their batteries and repaired the damage, but the message was clear. The defenders remained dangerous and determined. In the days that followed, British artillery intensified its bombardment. Mortars lobbed shells into the fort's interior, igniting stores and sending defenders scrambling for cover. Cannonballs tore through parapets, dismounting guns and scattering troops. The defenders fired back relentlessly, turning the plantation periphery into a deadly zone where falling shots smashed through trees and sent splinters scything through the air. The smell of gunpowder hung thick over the siege lines, mingling with the earthy scent of wet soil and crushed vegetation. Yet even as the artillery duel raged, the British recognized that bombardment alone would not capture Cornelis. Its layered defences demanded a decisive assault on the outer redoubts before the main fortress could be approached. The opportunity came sooner than expected. On August 24th, a deserter from the garrison slipped into the British lines under cover of darkness. He carried vital information. 2 of the outer redoubts on the northern side were vulnerable and could be taken by surprise if attacked swiftly. Major General Gillespie seized the chance. Though already weakened by fever, he prepared a nighttime assault force composed of British light companies, sepoys, and detachments of Highlanders. As night fell, the assault column advanced through darkened paths, lit only by occasional flashes of artillery fire. The ground was soft beneath their boots, and the air carried the distant rumble of guns pounding the main fortress. Every man knew that close combat awaited. In a sudden rush, Gillespie's men stormed the first redoubt, overwhelming the defenders before alarms could be fully raised. The second fell in similar fashion. Pressing the attack, Gillespie led a strike on a third redoubt. Fighting raged in the shadows as defenders struggled to counterattack. A French general, Joffre, was captured amid the chaos. Two Dutch officers, Holzmann and Müller, chose a final act of defiance, igniting a powder magazine that erupted in a fireball, killing themselves and many around them. The explosion lit the night sky with a momentary burst of orange flame, revealing the silhouettes of attackers and defenders alike before plunging them back into darkness. By dawn on August 25th, the British controlled the northern redoubts. A breach in the outer defences had been opened. The fall of Cornelis was now only a matter of time, but between the British and victory lay one more brutal night of fighting inside the bastioned heart of the fortress. On the night of August 25th, 1811, the atmosphere around Fort Cornelis was charged with a tense, electric energy. The British held the northern redoubts, but the fortress itself remained intact, its walls crowded with musketeers, its bastions lit by watchfires, its cannon ready to sweep the approaches with grapeshot. The defenders had been shaken by the loss of their outworks, yet they were not broken. Janssen still commanded thousands of troops within the fort, and though desertion had begun to thin his ranks, he believed the main works could withstand a direct assault. The weathered guns of the fortress, the depth of its trenches, and the complexity of its defences offered hope that the British might be delayed long enough for disease and exhaustion to sap their strength. But Auchmuty and Gillespie had no intention of waiting. With the outer line breached, the British prepared for the assault that would break the back of Napoleonic power in the East Indies. The decision was made to attack under cover of darkness, when confusion might spread among the defenders, and the formidable artillery of Cornelis would be less effective. Throughout the afternoon of the 25th, British and Indian troops gathered in forward positions. Light infantry, grenadier companies, sepoys of the Bengal and Madras regiments, and seasoned soldiers from Highland and Line battalions. They lay in the humid air, waiting for the appointed hour. Sweat soaked into their uniforms, and insects buzzed ceaselessly among the brush. The artillery duel continued in bursts, shaking the ground and sending clouds of dirt drifting through the plantations. As darkness descended, the preparations intensified. Scaling ladders were distributed. Officers moved along the lines, speaking in low tones, ensuring units understood their routes through the tight terrain. Engineers marked paths toward the final obstacles, trenches, palisades, and earthen embankments that ringed the fortress's northern face. In the distance, the fort glowed faintly with lanterns, its bastions silhouetted against the night sky. Occasionally, a flare from a mortar burst illuminated the scene for a heartbeat before fading, plunging the battlefield back into shadow. Shortly after midnight, the assault began. The first wave moved silently across the darkened ground, their forms barely visible among the pepper vines and scattered trees. They approached the trenches that encircled the bastions, negotiating soft earth that shifted beneath their feet. Ahead, the shapes of the fortification loomed, broad ramparts bristling with artillery, firing steps lined with soldiers peering into the night. As the attackers reached the ditch, the defenders opened fire. Muskets cracked from the parapets, and flashes of light burst across the walls. British soldiers surged forward, shouting to one another as they lowered ladders into the trench and began to climb the opposite face. Grapeshot tore into the packed ranks, and the air filled with splintered earth and smoke. But momentum carried them upward. Highlanders, sepoys, and light infantry scrambled over the parapet, crashing into the defenders in brutal, close-quarters fighting. Gillespie, weakened by fever yet relentless in his leadership, pressed through the chaos, directing units toward key bastions. The fighting was intense and immediate. Bayonets thrusting in the darkness, musket butts cracking against helmets and skulls, defenders recoiling in confusion as attackers poured through breached positions. Many defenders had fled or hidden after the previous night's disaster in the redoubts. Others fought with ferocity, determined to hold the bastions long enough for order to be restored. But order never returned. The British had struck too swiftly and too forcefully. As more units surged over the walls, Gillespie's men seized gun platforms and turned captured artillery inward. The The fort's interior, once a maze of barracks, magazines, and parade grounds, dissolved into scattered pockets of resistance. Fires sprang up where shells or burning debris ignited wooden structures, casting an eerie glow that illuminated the conflict in flickering shades of red and gold. Shadows danced across the smoke-filled air, giving the impression of far greater numbers than were actually present. In the heart of the fortress, the defenders attempted to rally, but confusion and fear spread faster than orders could be given. Officers struggled to form coherent lines. Soldiers who had been awake for days, deprived of rest by constant bombardment, faltered under the relentless assault. Some units surrendered where they stood, especially among native troops whose loyalty to the Franco-Dutch administration was already shaken. Others fought on, retreating toward the inner works, only to find themselves surrounded as British units closed from multiple directions. By dawn, the outcome was decisive. Fort Cornelis had fallen. British casualties in the assault were heavy, hundreds killed or wounded, but the defenders had suffered far more. Nearly 1,000 of Janssen's troops had been killed, and approximately 5,000 were captured, including officers of French and Dutch origin. The fortress, the greatest defensive stronghold of the East Indies, lay broken beneath a rising sun. Smoke spiraled upward from shattered bastions and burned-out buildings, drifting across the surrounding landscape. Janssens himself had escaped during the night, slipping away with a fragment of his remaining force toward the interior highlands near Buitenzorg. But his army as a coherent fighting entity had ceased to exist. The fall of Cornelis marked not only the tactical turning point of the campaign, but its symbolic victory. With the fortress gone, the French imperial presence in Southeast Asia had been mortally wounded. The soldiers who stood amid the ruins that morning understood the significance, even if only through exhaustion rather than reflection. They had stormed one of the largest and best prepared fortifications in the region, overcoming heat, disease, entrenched artillery, and layered defences. Ahead lay the pursuit of Janssens and the capture of the remaining towns and forts, still declaring loyalty to the Franco-Dutch regime. But for the moment, the guns of Cornelis were silent. The tropical dawn rose over a conquered fortress, and the British turned their eyes toward the interior, where the final act of the campaign awaited. With the sun rising over the smouldering ruins of Fort Cornelis, the British commanders understood that the strategic heart of the campaign had been pierced. But the campaign itself was not yet finished. Governor-General Janssens, though defeated, was not captured. During the chaotic night assault, he had gathered a small remnant of his troops, several hundred men at most, and retreated southward into the interior. His intention was to rally what forces remained loyal in the highlands, gather local auxiliaries, and perhaps draw British columns into the mountainous terrain, where he hoped narrow passes, disease, and ambush could work in his favour. For Auchmuty, this meant the fight was not over. Though Cornelis had fallen decisively, Java remained large, politically complex, and dotted with towns and forts that might resist unless the British demonstrated overwhelming control. If Janssens succeeded in regrouping, the campaign could stretch on for months, leaving the British exposed to the far more lethal enemy lurking in the plains: tropical disease. The British therefore moved quickly. Columns were dispatched from Cornelis and Veltevreden to secure nearby districts, control the roads, and prevent any remaining garrisons from coordinating with the fleeing governor. The men marched through plantations and scattered villages, still trembling from the previous day's thunderous bombardments. Smoke from the fort drifted across fields where farmers returned cautiously to their work, uncertain which flag now ruled Java. The sheer scale of the British victory at Cornelis produced a domino effect. On the nearby island of Madura, naval landing parties from HMS Hussar, Phaeton, Sir Francis Drake, and Dasher moved swiftly. On August 31st, they seized the town of Sumenep with little resistance. The fall of Madura removed yet another potential anchor for defensive operations and showcased British naval mastery in shallow waters. The sea, once patrolled by Franco-Dutch gunboats, now lay firmly under British control. Meanwhile, the main army reorganized. Thousands of prisoners were processed, while wounded British and sepoy soldiers were carried back toward the coast or treated in makeshift field hospitals. the sounds of moaning wounded mixed with the buzzing of flies as surgeons worked in the oppressive heat. Exhaustion weighed heavily on every unit. Men slept where they stood, lying across stacked muskets or collapsed beneath trees. Yet the pursuit of Janssens could not be delayed. Disease had already claimed lives in Batavia. To linger would invite further devastation. In the first days of September, Colonel Gibbs, commanding a forward column, received orders to push inland toward the Central Highlands. His route led through fertile plains, rising terrain, and dense forests, threaded with narrow tracks. Rice fields glowed emerald under the sun, and the higher air felt cleaner than the stagnant swamps near the coast. But the tranquility of the landscape masked the danger that lingered ahead. Janssens, though deprived of his fortress and most of his regular troops, managed to secure limited reinforcements. On September 3rd, he was joined by approximately 1,200 mounted irregulars under the Javanese leader Prince Prang Wedono. These horsemen, swift, lightly armed, and intimately familiar with the terrain, offered Janssens a fragile hope of continuing the fight. Their presence reflected the complex loyalties of Java, where local rulers navigated between colonial pressures and internal politics. But even with these reinforcements, Janssens could not rebuild a force capable of confronting the British army in open battle. As British columns advanced, they encountered the first signs of Janssens's retreat: abandoned camps, discarded equipment, and tracks leading deeper into the interior. The heat remained oppressive, even in the foothills. Sweat rolled down the faces of marching soldiers, soaking into their uniforms. The rumble of artillery dragged behind oxen echoed along narrow roads, while dense undergrowth forced the columns into single-file movement at times. Yet morale remained high. News of Cornelis's fall had energized the troops, giving them confidence that the campaign was nearing its end. On September 4th, another key coastal position, Cirebon, surrendered after the arrival of British naval forces. The appearance of HMS Nisus and HMS Phoebe triggered rapid capitulation from garrisons that no longer believed resistance could alter the outcome. French Staff Officer General Jamel was captured during the fall of Cirebon, further disrupting any attempt by Janssens to re-establish structured command in the region. Each surrender tightened the noose. Still, Janssens pressed deeper inland, attempting to reposition his remaining soldiers near the town of Salatiga. The surrounding mountains and ridges offered natural defensive possibilities, and the presence of local auxiliaries, though unreliable, suggested a final stand might be possible. But his troops were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly mutinous. Desertion spread rapidly among native units, many of whom had little interest in continuing the fight now that the central stronghold was gone. On September 16th, the British column under Colonel Gibbs reached the vicinity of Salatiga. Janssens, seeking to delay the inevitable, attempted to attack the advancing British forces. It was a desperate maneuver. The British, hardened by weeks of combat and movement, quickly formed their lines, preparing for cavalry assaults by Prince Prang Wedono's horsemen. In the confused engagement that followed, the Javanese irregulars charged, but were repulsed. British volleys cracked across the open ground, and the cohesion of the attacking force disintegrated. As the defenders fell back, chaos engulfed their retreat. Native auxiliaries, no longer willing to fight, turned on their Dutch officers. Several were murdered as order collapsed in the failing army. The last fragile structure of Janssens's resistance evaporated. His troops scattered. His officers were dead, captured, or in hiding. His remaining forces numbered barely a few dozen. 2 days after the defeat at Salatiga, Janssens accepted the inevitable. On September 18, 1811, he formally surrendered Java to Lieutenant General Auchmuty, ending the campaign after just 44 days. In less than 7 weeks, the British had captured Batavia, stormed one of the strongest fortifications in the region, neutralized the Franco-Dutch naval presence, seized key coastal positions, and pursued the governor into the island's interior. The campaign, though brief, demonstrated the overwhelming synergy of British naval dominance, disciplined infantry tactics, and the logistical strength of the East India Company's armies. The guns along Java's coast fell silent. The tricolour of France and the orange banner of the Dutch East Indies were lowered. A new authority rose in their place, one that would reshape the island's governance in surprising ways in the years to come. When Janssen surrendered on September 18, 1811, the campaign that had begun on the beaches of Silinsing concluded with a sense of both triumph and exhaustion. The British forces had completed one of the swiftest and most decisive operations of the Napoleonic era. Their victory had not only dismantled Napoleon's last major foothold in Southeast Asia, but had also reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the region. Yet for the men who marched through Java's plains, forests, and fortresses, the significance was tempered by fatigue, fever, and the staggering demands of occupation. The immediate aftermath of the campaign was marked by the rapid consolidation of British authority. The East India Company's officials, soldiers, and administrators moved quickly to secure forts, towns, and harbours. Naval patrols tightened control over surrounding waters, ensuring that no French or Dutch vessels could re-enter or threaten the island. On land, small British detachments fanned out to disarm local garrisons, collect surrendered weapons, and verify oaths of loyalty from local rulers who had previously aligned themselves with the Franco-Dutch regime. Amid this restructuring, one figure stood at the centre of the new administration: Sir Stamford Raffles. His long-standing advocacy for the conquest of Java, his deep knowledge of Southeast Asian politics, and his trusted relationship with Lord Minto positioned him to assume leadership. In the days that followed the surrender, Raffles was appointed Lieutenant Governor of Java, tasked with overseeing the island's transition from French-controlled Dutch colony to British administration. Raffles approached his responsibilities with determination and ambition. He envisioned Java as a territory that could be governed more efficiently, more profitably, and, by his own Enlightenment influence standards, more justly than under Dutch or French rule. His tenure would introduce significant reforms: changes to land tenure, adjustments to the taxation system, and efforts to reduce the arbitrary power of local landlords. He ordered studies of Javanese culture and history, believing that effective governance required understanding local customs. And while his policies remain debated by historians, Raffles undeniably left a mark on the island during his 5-year administration. But while the British looked to administrative matters, the human cost of the campaign lingered. The army that had stormed Fort Cornelis, captured coastal strongholds, and marched through the highlands, now contended with the quieter, relentless dangers of tropical disease. Even as military operations ceased, fevers continued to claim men in hospitals from Batavia to the outlying camps. The stench of stagnant canals and the hum of mosquitoes haunted British encampments long after the cannons fell silent. Surgeons and apothecaries worked day and night, but Java's climate remained as deadly as any battlefield. For the defenders of the Franco-Dutch regime, the fall of Java brought upheaval. Thousands of prisoners of war, Dutch officers, French soldiers, and native East Indies troops were processed, transported, or released, depending on their circumstances. Many native soldiers simply returned to their villages. Some Dutch administrators were sent back to Europe. Others remained under British supervision. The intricate political networks that connected local rulers to the colonial government were now reorganized under British influence, with Raffles and his officials negotiating new arrangements of authority. Across the island, communities that had watched the campaign unfold from behind rice fields and forest edges now faced a new colonial order. For many Javanese, the transition from Dutch-French to British rule brought little immediate difference in daily life. But for local elites, princes and regents, the shift meant renegotiating allegiances and obligations with a new imperial power. Some welcomed Raffles's promises of administrative reform. Others viewed British rule with suspicion, unsure of how long it would last. Indeed, the ultimate fate of Java was shaped not by events in Batavia or Salatiga, but by diplomacy in Europe. As British officials settled into their roles, the larger conflict of the Napoleonic Wars approached its final phases. The British had seized colonial possessions across the globe, from Mauritius to the Cape Colony, invoking both strategic necessity and imperial ambition. Yet when negotiations began after Napoleon's first fall from power, an unexpected arrangement emerged. According to the Convention of London, 1814, Java was to be returned to the newly restored United Kingdom of the Netherlands. It was a diplomatic gesture designed to strengthen the Dutch monarchy as a buffer against future French aggression in Europe. Thus, despite 5 years of British administration, the island was not to remain permanently within the British Empire. In 1816, British officials withdrew, formally handing Java back to Dutch control. Raffles departed for British-held Bencoolen on Sumatra, leaving behind both admirers and critics among the island's inhabitants. For Britain, the campaign remained a demonstration of its unmatched naval reach and its ability to conduct swift, coordinated amphibious warfare in distant lands. It showcased the effectiveness of joint operations between Royal Navy squadrons, East India Company forces, and British Army regiments operating far from home. It also reinforced Britain's image as the world's dominant maritime power, capable of striking any colony, any harbour, any garrison that aligned with Napoleon. For Java, the brief interlude of British rule introduced administrative ideas and reforms that would continue to echo through later Dutch policies. The storming of Fort Cornelis and the collapse of Janssens' defences had ended one chapter in the island's history and begun another, one shaped by both conflict and cooperation between Javanese society and European colonial powers. In the broader narrative of the Napoleonic Wars, the 1811 campaign remains a striking reminder that the struggle for global empire extended far beyond Europe's borders. Seas, forests, and distant archipelagos became theatres of war. And in these theatres, Britain's combination of disciplined infantry, experienced sepoy regiments, determined commanders, and overwhelming naval superiority proved decisive time and again. As the British soldiers who had landed at Silinsing months earlier prepared to leave Java behind, they carried with them memories of blistering heat, monsoon rains, the thunder of guns at Cornelis, and the eerie quiet of abandoned Batavia. Their victory had been hard-fought, swift, and transformative. In the long panorama of British military history, the invasion of Java in 1811 occupies a curious place. It was a triumph of planning, coordination, and execution, a rapid and decisive campaign that dismantled a major outpost of the Napoleonic Empire. It showcased the reach of British naval power, the discipline of British and East India Company troops, and the strategic insight of planners who understood that global warfare meant striking not only in Europe, but across the world's oceans. Yet for all its significance, the campaign remains overshadowed by the great battles of the Peninsular War, the sprawling drama of Trafalgar, and the final clash at Waterloo. Java became a footnote, distant in geography, fleeting in British control, and soon overshadowed by diplomatic currents that returned it to Dutch hands. But the legacy of the campaign is woven deeper into the fabric of imperial history than its obscurity suggests. The expedition against Java demonstrated with stark clarity how globalized the conflict against Napoleon had become. His imperial ambitions stretched across continents, reaching into the commercial arteries of the East Indies, and it was here, thousands of miles from Paris, that his influence was finally severed. The British did not simply defeat a garrison. They dismantled an entire system of colonial governance that had been folded into the French Empire. The fall of Fort Cornelis was not just a battlefield victory, it was the unraveling of Napoleon's eastern ambitions. The campaign also illustrated the effectiveness of combined operations involving British regulars, Indian sepoys, Royal Marines, and naval forces working in cohesion. The Redcoats who marched inland from Silinsing relied on sepoy battalions that formed half the army's strength, men who carried the traditions, discipline, and tactical formations of the East India Company into the heart of the Javanese plains. The fleet, ships of the line and frigates alike, provided not only transport, but also the decisive naval dominance that cut off French and Dutch communications and prevented reinforcements from arriving. In many ways, the invasion of Java was a precursor to later amphibious campaigns in the 19th century, demonstrating how swift, coordinated land and sea operations could topple colonial regimes in weeks. For the people of Java, The British interregnum introduced reforms and disruptions that would echo long after the Union Jack was lowered in 1816. Under Stamford Raffles, the island experienced an energetic, if controversial, period of administrative change. His attempts to modernize land tenure, reduce oppressive taxation, and cultivate a deeper understanding of Javanese culture left a mixed, complicated legacy. Some of his policies were short-lived, reversed or modified by the returning Dutch administration. Others, particularly his scholarly interest in local society, influenced later generations of colonial officials. Though Raffles's time in Java was brief, his impact endured in ways that outlasted the political authority he briefly wielded. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the 1811 campaign lies in what it reveals about the nature of empire during the Napoleonic era. European powers did not fight their wars solely on familiar terrain. They fought across climates, cultures, and continents. Java's fall showed that imperial rivalry was global and that the fates of distant islands could be shaped by decisions made in European courts and war rooms. The French loss of Java had little direct impact on the battles Napoleon fought in Russia or Germany, yet it symbolized the collapse of his aspirations to cast a shadow across Asia. In the struggle for global influence, Britain proved once again that it could project force with extraordinary speed and precision. Looking back, the scenes of the campaign retain a vivid, almost cinematic quality. The silent armada lying off the coast at dawn, the steady advance inland through plantations and forests, the thunderous siege of Fort Cornelis, the crackling night assault as redoubts exploded in flame, the pursuit of a defeated governor across misty uplands, and the final quiet moment when Janssens conceded defeat, ending 44 days that had altered the destiny of an island. In these events, one sees the blend of courage and hardship that defined soldiers of the era. The Redcoats and sepoys, who fought through tropical heat and monsoon rains, faced not only musket fire and artillery, but the looming threat of disease, the exhaustion of endless marches, and the unfamiliar terrain of a distant land. Their victory was not simply tactical, it was a testament to endurance, organization, and an unyielding sense of purpose. And so, the conquest of Java stands as one of the British Empire's most remarkable yet least remembered achievements. It was a campaign that encapsulated the themes of its age: global strategy, imperial ambition, and the relentless will to dominate the world's trade routes and colonial networks. Though overshadowed by battles fought closer to Europe, the fall of Java in 1811 reminds us that the Napoleonic Wars were not only battles of empires on European soil. They were contests for global supremacy fought on shores, forests, and fortresses scattered across the world. As the final echo of cannon fire faded from the walls of Cornelis, and as British soldiers prepared to march away from the island they had conquered, the tropical winds carried the scent of pepper vines, wet earth, and the long shadows of empire. Java's brief encounter with British rule had begun, and the memory of its swift and dramatic capture would linger, quietly, in the vast chronicle of imperial history. Thank you for listening to our story. If you found this battle as fascinating as we did, please like this video and subscribe to British War History for more. We read all of your comments, so be sure to leave your thoughts below. We'll see you in the next video.